Hey, this is Scott Photography Bonsai. Today I'm going to talk about the Yongnuo 100mm F2 lens for Nikon cameras. It's also called the YN100mm F2N. Yongnuo has been releasing quite a few autofocus lenses recently that are very cheap. A 50, a 35, and a 40mm, I believe. 35 isn't being reviewed too well, but the 50 is decent. I'd say the 100mm is more on the decent side of the spectrum. The manual lists this as having 9 aperture blades with a minimum aperture of f/19, which is a little confusing because on both of my cameras it lists f/22 as the minimum. So I think there's some firmware issues or something going on. Minimum focus distance is 0.9 meters or around 3 foot and a magnification of 0.14. So you're definitely not going to use this lens in those close-up focus situations. The lens doesn't come with a hood, but it does have a 58mm filter thread that you could potentially attach a hood to. It does have front and end caps that are pretty solid, are very similar to the Nikon ones. The lens exterior is a mixture of metal, plastic, and rubber. In the back, there's plastic similar to what the Nikon lenses have. And then in the front, there is solid metal. And the rubber is just, of course, the focus ring. Overall, the build quality is very nice, very solid, has a nice weight to it. The lens does come with a USB port for the potential of updating firmware or adjusting focus. So hopefully Yongnuo will release firmware updates in the future, as we'll get to. It needs a few adjustments. The lens does have a DC motor inside. It is louder than the silent wave motors in the Nikon lenses. Here's a quick example of autofocus sound. Most lenses in this price range are manual focus, so just keep that in mind when you're considering this lens. You're getting a very good value for having autofocus. The lens does have a switch on the side to cycle between autofocus and manual focus. It does not have the quick shift styled focus system. You have to actually use the switch to get into manual focus mode. Otherwise, you can rotate the focus ring in autofocus mode, but it does not do anything at all. So far in my testing, the lens is relatively decent with autofocus. It's not as fast as the Nikon lenses, of course, but it can get around the proper focal point you're selecting relatively quickly, but sometimes it takes a little longer than you would expect it to actually get a focus lock. In those situations, when I try to focus and recompose, I end up having the lens try to refocus because it didn't actually lock down on that focal point. So when the lens does get a focal lock, I'd say it's very consistent. I haven't had any issues with it, either front or back focusing. Again, hopefully all of the autofocus abilities of this lens will be further improved in the future with firmware updates. Manual focus really isn't too bad. Of course, you have to use that switch on the side of the lens to get into manual focus mode, but once you're there, there's a decent amount of travel to it, and of course the grip on there is very nice. With this lens, 100mm f2, it's pretty easy to see where you're focusing. I did take this lens out in the nighttime at a local park event where there's a light show, and didn't really have any issues with autofocus in those dark situations. Frankly speaking, this lens is garbage in live view mode with focusing. I can barely get it to lock down when I'm using that live view mode. So Yongnuo really needs to improve this situation with firmware updates. This lens does appear to have issues with exposure because both of my cameras read the lens as underexposing. For example, with the D750 I have to add +2 stops or plus 2.67 stops to get a properly exposed photo compared to my 50mm f1.8G lens. On the D600 it's not as bad. It's about 0.7 stops or 1 stop to get a properly exposed photo. Here's a quick test of distortion vignetting. See at f2, darkening of the corners is pretty strong, still not terrible. And up to f2.8, it's getting quite a bit better. And at f5.6, it's pretty much gone. With distortion, I'll leave it up to you to decide. There is some curvature, but I don't guarantee that my photos were exactly straight on. Just so you know, this was taken at 46 inches from the sensor to the object. So let's get to the example photos. They're in different sections. First one is Aberrations. Zoom right in. See, this one has some color fringing. It's pretty expected for this situation with taking photos of water like this, but it's not terrible. But we jump to 5.6 from f2, and then it's all gone, which is a great result. Can't complain about that. A sunset photo. In this case, it's a very extreme lighting situation, but you also get very extreme color fringing. So some purple, reds, greens. It's not a horrible result, it's not great, but I'll take it, it's decent. So in this case, just a little bit of red on the edges here and there. Not a terrible result in that situation. Last one for aberrations. So strong point light sources of full spectrum light. You can see you've got some purples and reds. Again, not a terrible result in this situation. So here is the flare and contrast section. Let's get started with these. See, this one is very strong flare. You've got some rainbowing effect. I think the light source was right to the side, so I'm pushing the lens very hard here. Extremely hard, I guess you could say. I mean, I don't know what to say about this result, but it's probably the most extreme situation you can get yourself into. So here's the sun is probably right about there in this area. You can still see some detail. I don't think it's a horrible result considering what's going on. So here's one that's a little more manageable. You can see the contrast is not especially good in this situation. We zoom in. There's still a nice amount of detail considering. You can fix this up pretty easily. Let's develop this one real quick just to show that you can get that contrast easily back with just a few quick edits. So I'm going to cycle the change. So that's before, after, before, after. So this one I really like the image, but there is that strong flare situation. So up in the top left is where the sun was, and then you've got a lot of detail, and I really like the image itself. Here's another one. I don't even know what was going on here. It's just a cloudy or something situation. Got very poor contrast. Again, we could easily develop this and bump up the contrast, so it's not a huge deal. So here are a few images detailing the sharpness and rendering of the lens. I think it's a very sharp lens. This is at f2, if you can believe it. Look at how sharp that is. I can easily see the veins of this leaf. So when you buy a lens like this, you generally want to use it at larger apertures. And this lens seems like it is especially good at f2, f2.8. Let's go to another one. Zoom in on the face. Little bit blurry. It might have been my mistake, but still you can see a lot of detail in the eye, in the beak. Again, here you can see these individual strands. So here's a good one of just so much going on. Very, very busy image. So I definitely think this lens is good for any type of situation that you want to resolve a nice amount of detail. There's another one. Zoom in, you can see my action camera. Lots of texturing on the top here. Not too bad. That was at f4. Here's one of a little grasshopper guy, f5.6. So just a small section of the frame. We zoom in, we see lots of nice detail on him. So in this section, we're going to go over background blur, which I think is especially important in a lens like this. So you can see nice, smooth background blur. This is f2. So here is an autofocus photo. You can see they aren't perfectly round. Let's zoom in on them. We don't have any haloing effect on the point light sources. Let's jump up to, let's see, this is f2. Now this is very decent result. You do get some haloing here, and it isn't perfectly round. I'm not going to complain though, I think it looks nice. So again, a little bit of haloing, but besides that, I'm liking this background blur of this lens. So that was f2. Let's jump up to 2.8. Definitely see a difference. Let's cycle that real quick. Again, pretty similar results, just more sharp in the background. Let's go up to f4 now. Similar situation. Just a little bit more in the background. Jump up to 5.6. Again, it's not quite rounded, but still relatively circular. At least we're not getting those donut shapes. I hate those. So I'm definitely glad this lens doesn't do the donut point light sources. So here is f8. Definitely a lot more detail in the background, but again, very similar result. It just scales as you decrease that aperture size. So look in the top here, it's very grainy, but it's ISO 6400. See, very similar result to the previous photos. Nice point light sources in the back. Of course, it's these things, just a whole bunch of them. Similar situation. I'm very happy with the background blur of this and foreground of this lens. Look at the edges. Here's my last section. These are just a few images that I edited to improve contrasts and such. I really like landscape photos at large aperture, get an interesting look to them. So for example, the focal point is in this area right there. It just looks very interesting to me when photos are rendered like this. Another one, lots of cool detail in this shot. See all the cars, can't exactly, oh, I can see some of that license plate. Go to the next one. Great sunset photo, vertical shot. So in this case, I probably tried to improve this area a little bit more. So this lens can give a very dreamy look to it, which is something I like about it. As I mentioned probably before, I had a few manual focus lenses for Pentax that gave me similar look to the background blur and this kind of not super high contrast, but very sharp and quality image. Take a look at it in detail here, but I really like how it renders. So I'm definitely going to keep this lens now that I've looked at it in detail. So here's another large aperture landscape photo. Focal point was right here in these leaves. There's another one at night. Had some noise reduction on this one, definitely. But very sharp, nice smooth gradients. So I think this one was using autofocus. It worked out pretty well in an extremely dark situation. So that's it for example photos. Now we're going to do the summary real quick on this lens. So would I recommend the Yongnuo 100mm F2 lens for Nikon cameras? I think it really depends at the moment. Hopefully in the future they'll fix a few issues that I've had, such as the exposure issue, which is the biggest problem, and also the autofocus not locking quite as quickly as I would want, as well as it not autofocusing well at all in live view mode. But besides those issues, which I think are relatively easy to deal with, I think it is a solid lens, nice build quality. I really like the image output. Aberrations and such are not terrible, and it is very sharp, at least my copy. So I'm glad with the image quality, which is the biggest factor. But besides that, it is a cheap autofocus lens. You can get it new. That's great. Alternatives, there really probably aren't too many. You can probably get a used macro lens, 100mm f2.8 with a focus limiter. Be similar to this, so that is an option. But besides that, I think it's a relatively decent lens if you can deal with the quirks. Hopefully those will be fixed in firmware moving forward. So that is the Yongnuo 100mm f2 lens for Nikon cameras. I found this interesting. Thanks.